Good morning.
Thank you. I appreciate that. We're going to talk about taxes and politics for an hour. You better get a little more excited than that, right? So let's just out of interest of time, because we are a little bit compressed on time, I'm just going to jump right into what we're primarily focused on. And I'm going to build off what Sue talked about just a moment ago, that high net worth investors look at their investments and make decisions looking through a tax lens. And that's why we want to talk about politics, because as we know, politicians set tax philosophy. So that's why we're going to focus on these issues. But I want to do that by primarily focusing on these particular areas. I want to start with the fiscal debate that we're having in our country, or maybe more appropriately, the fiscal debate that we should be having. I think you would agree we've somewhat tabled that fiscal discussion over the last year, and I'm going to try to make an argument as to why that may not be in our best interest, certainly not our investors' best interest. We're also going to talk a bit about the elections because we're only a matter of 29 days away. But more importantly, I want to talk about the impact of those elections on some pretty big issues in our country, specifically tax reform, but also the Affordable Care Act. In order to get started, let's start with that fiscal debate. And anytime I'm talking about one of these big issues like the fiscal situation of our country, I like to start by trying to drill it down to the simplest level. And when I do that around this budget and debt and deficit issue, I came up with this very simple question that we need to answer. Is the federal debt a real concern or not? Now, believe it or not, 20% of the Democrats absolutely believe that this debt and deficit issue, it's all smoke and mirrors. It's all made up by the Republicans. But at least that many Republicans think it's the only deal and be damned anything else. So that leaves us with about 60% of our elected officials who agree we have a problem. They just have a fundamental disagreement in how and how quickly it needs to be addressed. And ladies and gentlemen, that is the crux of every meaningful debate our country is going to have for the foreseeable future. How and how quickly we address this debt and deficit issue. Oh, it'll come out in terms of immigration reform or minimum wage. It doesn't matter. Boil it down, it's how and how quickly we address this issue. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're a very learned audience. You're saying, hold on a second, Jeff. I've heard from the president, I've heard from the Republicans that debt's actually coming down as a percentage of GDP. It's actually being paid down at this point. So maybe those Democrats are right. Maybe there's nothing to worry about. This data was released by the Congressional Budget Office in September of 2013. Let me show you what happened a mere 9 months after they released this data. They updated the numbers. In a simple 9-month period, we've absolutely lost that drop in debt to GDP ratio. And you know who we get to blame, don't you? That's right, we get to blame those Democrats, right? But also the Republicans. Both parties have been equally complicit in refunding the sequestration cuts. And ladies and gentlemen, that was the only reason we were dropping in that debt to GDP ratio. But let me ask you a question. Was the CBO telling us a short-term debt story? No. They were telling us a long-term debt story. And what they're telling us is that debt to GDP ratio is continuing to rise in the projected time frame we're looking at. Now, just like what happens in our personal lives, you can't add debt infinitum without there being a day of reckoning. And that's what the CBO is telling us, is that we are on a path, using their words, we are on a path to unsustainability of the U.S. debt situation. And that sounds a little scary, so we probably ought to discover what's driving that issue. Well, it really is nothing more than the difference between the federal government's revenue, i.e. federal tax revenue, and what it spends on an annual basis. And I know what you're saying. You're looking at that graph and you're saying, well, Jeff, that line's not that far apart. Maybe that's not that big of a deal. Well, keep in mind, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars. So it is a challenge. It's a real number. But more importantly than that, the United States is a little bit of a unique kind of debtor. And what I mean by that is we don't pay principal, do we? We only make interest-only payments. And we know how that worked out in the housing industry, don't we? So that's exactly the same type of debtor the United States is as it relates to this long-term debt. Now, if that's true, the other trend you notice is that those two lines are slowly separating. So we need to understand, well, what's driving that separation? And it boils down to the cost of health in the United States. Also, the entitlement programs, if you wrap all that together. If you think about the entitlement programs, they make up 60% of our federal budget. And we're talking about Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Now, more concerning than that 60% number is how quickly they're growing. Right now, they're growing at 7.2% a year, and we understand why, but 7.2% growth rate in those entitlement programs is directly comparable to long-term GDP growth. Is there anyone here that thinks our long-term GDP growth in the United States is going to average 7.2%? Anyone? No. That's the problem. That's what's driving the separation of those numbers. Now, that's the spending. That's that top little line. But what about that bottom line? Go back to the federal revenues. As you know, we had that huge tax increase in January of 2013. As a matter of fact, January 2013 tax increase was the largest tax increase in U.S. history in dollar terms. Even with that tax increase of 2013, we're still paying an average effective tax rate in the United States that's historically low. Now, you remember, effective tax rate is what we actually write a check for compared to our gross income. So as much as we have anxiety over marginal rates, the real number that we probably ought to pay attention to is that effective tax rate. And again, we're at an average effective tax rate that's rather low. Now, interest rates obviously play into this equation as well, and I'm going to leave that to the economists. Suffice it to say that our analysis right now is that we have a pretty complicit partner in reining out some of that liquidity that we have in our economy. So we're rather optimistic, if you will, that we can actually constrain long-term interest rate growth. But what is true is that clearly we are growing in that debt to GDP ratio, and that includes a normalization of those interest rates. But there are probably some wild cards that we need to take into account as well, right? We're talking about politics. So let's talk about some of the wild cards that we're focused on at the Washington Update. First of all would be foreign affairs. I think you would agree we put the country back on a stronger war footing as of late, and that comes at a cost. You remember what I said, that the only reason we were dropping in that debt to GDP ratio was because of those sequestration cuts? Well, ladies and gentlemen, the lion's share of those cuts were very backloaded. In other words, bigger cuts into the future. And by law, 50% of those cuts have to come from the defense budget. So if we're putting ourselves on a stronger war footing again, that's going to come at a cost. And that cost has to be funded somehow. And we know the likely outcome of that is additional issuance of debt in the United States. We also could have an economic surprise. And interestingly, as I travel around the country, primarily I do big client events. And when I talk to your clients, business owners, what they tell me is they're optimistic. They have cash on the sidelines. They're ready to take advantage of opportunities that they see once they have certainty. And that certainty seems to be centering around tax certainty. So you can see that blends right into tax reform, which we're going to talk about where the two parties are right now, but then also the Affordable Care Act. Now, a lot has been made about the cost of the Affordable Care Act. It was always projected that it was going to cost about $1 trillion in its first 10 years. And the good news is it's coming in just slightly over budget. And what that means in federal government's term is that it's about 10% over budget. So it's expected that it's going to come in about $1.1 trillion. So again, in federal government terms, that's not bad. That's about in line with what we would hope for in any type of federal program. Now, we can argue about the merits of the Affordable Care Act, and we are going to talk about the Affordable Care Act, but bottom line, the goal of the Affordable Care Act was to more broadly distribute health insurance in the United States. And that's because when we started this process, there were 60 million uninsured in our country. Now, what's clear is that we're in the implementation phase of the Affordable Care Act. What I like to say is that we're actually in the conviction bias stage of the Affordable Care Act's implementation. And you know what I mean. Conviction bias, you deal with it every single day. If you have a client that comes in and they have a very strongly held belief about a particular issue, you can talk until you're blue in the face. You are not going to convince them that they're wrong. They're going to hold on to the one or two facts that prove that they're right. And that's exactly where we are right now. If you're a fan of the Affordable Care Act, there are a lot of great reasons for you to be excited. If you're not a fan of the Affordable Care Act, there are just as many reasons up there why you may not believe we're on the right track as it relates to the Affordable Care Act. What is clear is that this is a huge movement in our country, a huge law that we're trying to implement. And anytime we're implementing a huge law like that, it takes time to really understand the law's long-term efficacy, both positively and or negatively. So I don't know that 10 months into the implementation of the law, we have a firm grasp as to that long-term efficacy of the law. What that does allow us to do, though, is frees us up to look at the benchmarks, the long-term benchmarks of that law. And remember I said the goal was to more broadly distribute health insurance to the 60 million uninsured. It's anticipated that fully 30 million people will gain insurance for the first time. And that's awesome. That's half of the uninsured. But it also means that 30 million people will still lack affordable health insurance in our country, even after we fully implemented a guaranteed issue and guaranteed renewable health insurance program. Now, these 30 million people will still lacking affordable health insurance. They'll still be getting sick. They'll be waiting until they're acute, and they show up at our emergency room. Do our emergency rooms have to treat those individuals? Yeah, it's the law. And I know what you're saying. You're saying, but Jeff, that's the way it works now, so what's the big deal? And you're absolutely right. The real opportunity here are those 30 million people gaining insurance for the first time. And let me explain what I mean. If you and I got insurance for the very first time, you'd think the first thing we'd do is get a primary care physician, we'd get a thorough physical, and we'd start treating chronic conditions like high blood pressure, high cholesterol, all that fun stuff we get to deal with. Now, I imagine there's a pretty good contingency of people here from Massachusetts, right? In Massachusetts, it's about 7 years ahead of the rest of the country in implementing this type of program. So if you think about it, it's kind of a neat little test for the rest of the country. And we can glean some interesting statistics coming out of Massachusetts. And what we find in Massachusetts is when someone gets insurance for the very first time, what do you think they change about their consumer buying behavior? Nothing. They wait until they get sick, they wait until they're acute, even though they're fully insured, and they show up in the emergency room. So if we don't change the buying behavior of those 30 million people gaining insurance for the first time, ladies and gentlemen, we haven't saved a dime. We've just traded pockets as to how we're paying for it, but we're still paying the same cost of health care. And there are lots of arguments as to why that individual would still wait and use the emergency room. Some of it is demographic, some of it is cost. Yeah, I'm insured, but I have a $5,000 deductible. I can't afford that either. So that's a challenge that we have inside the Affordable Care Act's implementation. But bottom line, one way or the other, that's influencing a lot of what's happening in Washington. Not as much politically as perhaps the Republicans had hoped moving into these midterm elections. But it also allows me to bridge slightly over to tax reform, because as you know, a big part of the Affordable Care Act is also funded through some tax changes. Now, how many of you here knew that there's actually a lot of bipartisan agreement on tax reform? How many of you knew that? Yeah, both parties agree that we should clean up and simplify the tax code. That's what they agree on. That's it. At that point, they go two very different directions. The Republicans want to clean up and simplify the tax code, all in an effort to broaden the base, in other words, more people paying in, but lower the marginal rates, and understand that the rewriting of the tax code will not generate one new dollar of federal tax revenue. Now, what the Republicans will tell us is that that will unleash untold economic growth. And that untold economic growth will generate a ton of new revenue for the federal government. And they're fine with that. They just don't want the writing of the code to generate one new dollar. Now, Democrats take a little bit different approach when it comes to tax reform. They want to clean up and simplify the tax code to make it more fair. And fair is a bit of a code word when we hear that from Democrats as it relates to tax reform. What they're really referring to is the progressivity of the U.S. tax code. Go back to that tax increase of January of 2013. It only accomplished two goals. It increased the complexity of the U.S. tax code, but more importantly, and what you're hearing from your best clients, highest income, highest net worth clients, is that it increased the progressivity of the U.S. tax code. In other words, a larger share of that federal tax burden is falling on a narrower percentage of our U.S. population. And you know what? Democrats believe there's still a lot more room to increase the slope of that progressivity curve. So that's what they're primarily focused on, and to their credit, they've been clear. Most importantly, they've been consistent in that position. What they say is that we should cap all itemized deductions at 28%, regardless of what the highest marginal rate would be. As a matter of fact, they would also increase the marginal rate slightly. Additionally, they would also institute a minimum tax, in essence, a new AMT, or a different version of the AMT, called the Buffett rule. What they suggest is that if you're making more than $1 million of adjusted gross income on an annual basis, you should pay a minimum tax of 30%, regardless of the source of that income. Now start thinking about your clients that fit into that category. Now, right now, they just had a 67% increase in capital gains with that tax increase we just had in January 2013. Now they'd take an additional 40% raise in capital gains. Now, would that impact the advice and guidance you're giving to those high-income individuals? It better. It better change the way you're investing for those individuals because, again, remember, they look at investments through a tax lens. But the Democrats don't stop there. What they also suggest is that we go back to the 2009 estate tax rates, going from the current 5.3 roughly million exemption down to 3.5 million, go from the current 40% rate back up to 45% rate. Now, I really should parse my words. Ironically, this is not necessarily a Democratic initiative. What it is a President Obama initiative. President Obama is very fixated on going back to that 2009 estate tax code. The Democrats, not so much. The Democrats, specifically in the Senate, want to focus primarily on that lifetime gifting limit. Because you remember back in 2009, the unified credit and the lifetime gifting limit were not married. We had a $3.5 million exemption, but a $1 million lifetime gifting limit. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that number down here is the number that the Democrats are focusing on. The Democrats as a group aren't so much concerned about monies passing at death. They want to talk about money passing while we're alive. So think about your clients that you're trying to do estate planning with. Maybe they have a family business or an illiquid asset like timberland or ranch land or something like that. If you could go from the current $5.3 million gifting while you're alive back down to $1 million, does that change how and the tools that you can bring to bear in estate planning for that client? Again, it better. It's a huge change that it would be for estate planning. Now, the Democrats also say that we need to close loopholes. Well, that's somewhat of a ubiquitous term. The thing I want to focus you on primarily is that sub-S income reclassification. Say that after 2 cocktails. I'll be impressed if anybody can do it. So what I mean by that, and it's a little bit of a jargony kind of thing, but see if this sounds familiar. I realize we all own our own businesses, and the majority of those probably are pass-through entities. And a majority of our clients' business owners are probably pass-through entities as well. In other words, as owners of those companies, we get to set our own W-2 wage, don't we? That's pretty cool. But how many of your clients, because I know none of us do it, how many of our clients pay themselves a very low W-2 wage, and at the end of the year, they pay themselves a big distribution? Does that sound familiar? Why do they do that? Payroll taxes. You only pay payroll taxes on that low W-2 wage. And keep in mind, and I know I'm preaching the choir, but keep in mind we're talking about the employer and employee portions of the payroll taxes. So this is not an insignificant number. Well, the Democrats see that nothing more than a tax dodge. They suggest that 100% of the distributions going through my LLC and S Corp should be subject to those payroll tax limits. Not 100% of my income, I'm saying 100% of the flow through that company should be subject to those payroll tax limits of roughly $115,000. So again, is that a big tax increase for our business owners? Yeah, could be as much as $10,000, $15,000 more that they would have to pay in taxes. Now, we hadn't gotten a lot of details from the Republicans. They had been rather generic in saying they want to broaden the base, lower the rates, everybody will be happy, kumbaya, until we got the proposal from Dave Camp. And so I want to take a few minutes and go through the Republican proposal, but I want to define how I'm describing this proposal. Ladies and gentlemen, I probably ought to change the slide. It probably should say the moderate GOP proposal as opposed to the GOP proposal. What I mean by that is when we go through this, you'll find it rather stark in the sense that the majority of Republicans don't even like the GOP proposal. Now, why is that relevant? It's relevant that the majority of Republicans don't like Dave Camp's plan because the majority of Democrats, they don't like President Obama's plan either. So if you then compare Dave Camp's proposal with the president's proposal, you start seeing quite a bit of overlap. You start seeing an area where perhaps the dialogue of true tax reform could start taking root. And that's why I want to spend some time on this issue. Now, Dave Camp was constrained by some of the goals that the GOP party had put out, and one of those constraints came around marginal tax brackets. And what I mean by that is the Republicans had promised us that we would get down to 2 marginal tax rates, and Dave Camp accomplished that with a 10 and 25% rate. Oh, unless you earn more than $450,000, then you get a surtax of 10%. Can we just call a spade and give Dave a break? There are 3 marginal tax brackets in his plan, right? 10, 25, and 35%. What was more interesting is, why did he choose $450,000? In his press conference, he said that it would only impact the highest income 1% of our population. And when I heard that, I thought, wow, that number seems really high. I remember a year and a half ago when we were talking about those 1%ers, they only made $360,000. So somewhere I missed out on a $90,000 raise. So I don't know about you, but I missed it. So I got to find out what's going on. And it wasn't until I got the details of his budget that I was able to figure it out. You see, uniquely, what the Republicans are suggesting is that we need to redefine what taxable income is. Not only what's includable in taxable income, but just as importantly, what could not be excluded from taxable income. And let me explain what I mean. To the extent that your client's employers pay a portion of their health insurance premium, as you know right now, we don't pay taxes on that employer benefit, do we? Not unlike life insurance and long-term disability, where we pay a tax on that premium paid. Well, the Republicans see that as an opportunity. So they see that as no different than life and long-term disability. They believe that employer portion of the health insurance premium should be added to taxable income. Additionally, if you're making these kind of monies, I imagine you're maxing out your 401k. I also imagine you're maxing out your pre-tax traditional 401k because you're trying to avoid some of that current taxation. Well, you wouldn't be able to do that anymore or any longer as well if the Republicans had their way. They would force the first half of your retirement savings could go into a traditional pre-tax 401k, but the second half would be forced to go to a Roth 401k. Now, why is that? Post-tax. You see, in order to get the 10 and 25 and 35% tax rate, Dave Camp had to generate additional revenue somewhere else in the code. And you're starting to see how those revenue pieces are coming together. Now, the one that jumps off the screen here at you probably is municipal bond income. I'm not going to spend any time on that today because, quite honestly, it was a cheap way for the Republicans to get a little more revenue to make those rates come down. Bottom line is, it's not going anywhere. So you have no concerns in the immediate future that municipal bond taxation is going to change. Certainly will not change in a tactical way. So we're not going to spend any time on that today. But I mentioned earlier, it's important what's includable in taxable income, but also it's important what cannot be excluded from taxable income. Now I'm going to ask for a little audience participation. How many of you and keep your hands up, how many of you are here from California, Illinois, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey? Does anybody hear the commonality there? It's high state and local income taxes. Well, guess what, ladies and gentlemen? If the Republicans have their way, you would no longer be able to deduct those state and local taxes. Did you just take a big tax increase? Yeah, you definitely did. A huge one in those particular states. Maybe not here in Texas, but certainly in other states. In addition to that, I know that you've spent a tremendous amount of effort educating your wealthiest clients on the value of passing those qualified assets most efficiently through the multiple generations using that stretch concept. Well, congratulations, that entire concept of stretch IRA, that would go away if the Republicans had their way. We'd go back to the old way of doing IRA distributions of an immediate or a 5-year liquidation. Again, he had to generate additional revenue. Now, you've no doubt heard from your clients over the last month or so, now that they've met with their CPAs and they're truing up their year-end taxes, that they may have been a little bit surprised about how their taxes went up. Did that catch anybody by surprise? Well, bottom line, the majority of that tax increase for our best clients came from that new 3.8% tax, the 3.8% tax on taxable investment income for any clients that earn over $250,000. Well, interestingly, the Republicans keep that 3.8% tax in their tax plan. Now, go back to what I said when we started talking about the GOP proposal. I told you that this was the moderate GOP proposal, right? And in my opinion, which I guess is why I'm here, in my opinion, that this is the Republican moderates coming to grips with the fact that they are not going to have enough votes to actually repeal the Affordable Care Act. And so then they're saying, well, if we can't repeal it, let's at least make sure it's paid for. Because that 3.8% tax pays for half of the Affordable Care Act's expenses. Additionally, one thing that the Republicans added in there on the personal tax side, all ironically affecting some of those same people that raised their hand earlier, is that mortgage interest rate deduction would go from the current $1 million down to $500,000. That was actually a part of Simpson-Bowles. Now I'm going to switch gears a little bit because Dave Camp is a very intelligent man, especially as it relates to taxes and how all that operates. And he realized that in our country, you cannot divorce personal tax reform from corporate tax reform. So he went ahead and took the effort on and talked about corporate tax reform as well. And he applied the same kind of mentality to corporate taxes. As you know, right now we have the highest marginal corporate tax rates in the OECD countries, the countries we compare ourselves to. The Republicans would lower that marginal tax rate to 25%. But don't get excited, it's a revenue neutral, remember what I said. And so we had to find sources of revenue to offset that marginal rate decrease, even though it only affects a relatively small percentage of the corporations in our country, or in the United States. And what he found is an opportunity around repatriation. We've heard about these trillions of dollars sitting offshore, not being taxed in the United States. Well, the Republicans, if they have their way, would force repatriation of those trillions of dollars over the next 8 years and tax it at a relatively competitive 8.75%. Again, Dave Camp had to find additional sources of revenue. Now, this is one of those areas where Dave got himself a little bit crossways with the Republican Party. You see, the stated position of the Republican Party is that we want to move to a territorial tax system. Well, ladies and gentlemen, by definition, a territorial tax system says you never have to repatriate profits. You never are forced to. So while it's interesting that Dave forces past earnings onshore, he would never force future earnings. So you see a little bit of incongruency there. And that's one of those things that has to get reconciled as we talk about tax reform. Now, I think I've kind of beat up that tax reform discussion to some degree, but there's one area I want to focus on specifically. We just came out with a new white paper on this, around this inversion issue. Are you absolutely sick to death of the word inversion? Yeah, so am I. I say it every day, multiple times. Bottom line is, we're not done with it. We're going to hear more and more about it. And the reason why is that was built by both parties as a driving mechanism to get populist anger significant enough to drive corporate tax reform. You had Republicans and Democrats cooperating behind the scenes to try to get us angry about this inversion issue. And we know there are a lot of fancy ways to get around some of the U.S. taxes. We've heard about earnings stripping, hopscotching, cash boxing, spin version, all of which we're very familiar with and we're very intimately knowledgeable of. Yeah, right. But we know that Secretary Lew, 2 Mondays ago, dealt with this issue. He took it off the table. He changed the regulations. It's no longer an issue, right? Except for earnings stripping. You see, there's a challenge. Earnings stripping actually has to be dealt with legislatively. It cannot be dealt with through rulemaking. Well, let me disappoint you here for a moment. That earnings stripping actually accounts for 95% of the tax savings of an inversion. So while it may look like, it may feel like that we actually address this inversion issue with Secretary Lew's regulatory changes, we actually ignored 95% of the issue, because we can't deal with earnings stripping without changing the law. What is interesting and why we came out with a white paper is that we were getting a lot of questions from advisors and clients as to what do we do with these inverting companies. And what I mean by that, a lot of financial advisors are still a little bit unclear as to how the taxation of inversions work. Some of you may have some retired executives of Medtronics or Burger King. Some of these companies are thinking about inverting. One thing that we want to make sure everybody understands is that on the day that inversion closes, that's a capital gains recognition day for those clients. Now you think about it, if you've been a retired executive from Burger King or Medtronics and you have a lion's share of your net worth tied up in that company's stock at an extremely low basis, does that change some planning that you need to do with that client? So if you have any clients that fall into that category that are large position holders and in those inverting companies, you need to be aware that that could be a huge capital gain issue for those clients. But the question we get most often is, well, Jeff, I understand that this is going to unleash tremendous amount of earnings per share for these inverting companies just because of the tax savings. So maybe I should buy into these inverting companies right now as an opportunity for higher earnings growth down the road. And we see absolutely the opposite of that when we look historically speaking. What we find is that half the companies that invert actually underperform their peer group. Half the companies outperform. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you and I are not in a flip of a coin business, are we? That's not the business we're in. So we are saying do not buy into an inversion just because you think there's going to be a windfall of earnings because of that tax savings. Now, don't get me wrong. If that merger of those two companies actually is a benefit, it actually provides a great growth opportunity for this new entity, well, that may be a reason to buy into it, just like any other merger. We're just saying don't buy into it specifically for that opportunity of tax savings. Clear? Okay. Well, let's talk about politics, because obviously that influences tax behavior and so forth, so we need to understand what direction Washington is going politically. And let's start with the House of Representatives. We know the Democrats need to pick up 17 seats in order to gain a majority in the House of Representatives, and we always look at these elections both objectively, but also subjectively. And when we look at the House of Representatives in a subjective manner, what we find is very interesting. No sitting president has ever gained as many as 17 seats in a midterm election. So you see a bit of an uphill for the Democrats as it relates to the House of Representatives. But quite honestly, the House of Representatives is much more of an objective story. And let me explain why. There are currently 17 Republicans sitting in House districts that Obama won back in 2012. So even if we gave the Democrats all 17 of those seats, you still have to account for the 9 Democrats sitting in House districts that Romney won. So you just see a mathematical challenge for the Democrats to try to pick up any type of 17 seats. Now, gird yourselves. I'm going to share with you the most depressing statistic in my presentation with the next mouse click. I know what you're saying. You're saying, really? It's hard to believe. But it's true. We're going to elect in 29 days 435 House of Representative members. Every 2 years, we get to vote them in and vote them out. Of those 435 House seats, literally 14 of them are considered toss-ups. Literally, only about 3% of the House of Representatives is actually in play in November. And you know who we get to blame for that, don't you? You and I. You and I gave single-party control to the majority of states back in 2012, meaning at the state level, their House and Senate are either all Republican or all Democrat. And 2012 was a very important year. That's the year they got to redraw those House district maps. And they somewhat do that creatively, and that creative process is called gerrymandering. Now, I showed you that graphic earlier, and you thought I was giving you a Rorschach test, and I wasn't. What it is actually are the 6 most highly gerrymandered districts in the United States. And you can see just how creative these elected officials that you and I put in Washington actually are. But because the Republicans, the GOP, controlled the majority of states back in 2012, that's why they have a numerical advantage in the House of Representatives. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to tell you, if the Republicans, it is unlikely the Republicans will lose the control of the House of Representatives through 2022. They will really have to screw up badly in order to lose the House. Now, let's not put anything past them, right? Either party. But it's certainly unlikely that the Republicans would lose control of the House between now and 2022. Now, it also is why the party's gerrymandering issue, it's why the incumbents were running for the walls of their party. And what we mean by that is that Democrats ran left, Republicans ran right in order to fend off primary challengers. They aren't worried about someone from across the aisle stealing their seat. They're worried about someone coming up from behind them to steal their seat. And it's that running for the walls is the single biggest reason for the polarization that we see in Washington, specifically in the House of Representatives right now. It also means the Senate elections are just that much more important. So let's talk about the Senate elections real quickly. We know Republicans need to pick up 6 seats in order to gain a majority. You know that we look at these elections objectively and subjectively. Well, quite honestly, the Senate elections are much more of a subjective story, and let me explain what I mean. Someone help me out. How many years ago was this class of senators elected? 6 years ago. 6 years ago was 2008. And follow with me for real quick. In 2008, if you recall, there was a groundswell of excitement within the Democratic Party to show up in November and vote for then candidate Obama, right? In other words, he had very long political coattails. Now, does anyone disagree that those coattails have shrunk dramatically in the last 6 years? No? I didn't think so. That's the subjective challenge the Democrats have in picking up or holding the majority in the Senate. But we also look at these things, as I mentioned, objectively. So we took the time to actually break down every single Senate seat that even has a chance of changing hands in November. And what you see is a very clear numerical advantage for the Republicans to take control. And keep in mind here, we're talking about a simple majority, not a supermajority, and I'll get into that in a moment. But what's interesting is when you look at these numbers, I will tell you the trend, though, is that these races are tightening. We had the likelihood of the Republicans picking up majority at about 60% 3 weeks ago. It's, I'd say, about 55% today. So we're seeing these races tighten very quickly and in some pretty surprising places, like Kentucky and so forth, and Iowa. So it's going to be a fascinating Senate elections. And I'll remind everybody, back in 2012, the Democrats surprised everyone by picking up 5 seats. No one had the Democrats picking up 5 seats back in 2012. So don't think this is a foregone conclusion either way at this point. But what is clear is that the Republicans have no path forward to getting to 67 votes. Remember, their stated goal is that they want to repeal the Affordable Care Act. Unless you believe President Obama would actually sign that bill, the Republicans need 67 votes, not seats, 67 votes in the Senate to make that happen. We don't see a path forward to 67 votes. So we think repeal of the Affordable Care Act is off the table at this point. The real question is, do the Republicans have a path to 60 votes? And why 60 votes in the Senate? That's the filibuster rule. And I know what you're saying. Hold on a second, Jeff. Harry Reid busted the filibuster rule earlier this year. So what's the big deal? Well, Harry Reid only busted the filibuster rule for federal judges and presidential appointees, not for legislation or Supreme Court justices. And I'm here to tell you, that's why we are not seeing Ruth Bader Ginsburg retire at this moment, because she knows that that seat would have to go up against a 60-vote threshold in the Senate. And that's why we're not seeing any changes on that level. So if you're concerned about the Senate as to who is going to take majority, it's quite possible we won't know during this lame duck session. And let me explain. There are 2 states that are causing a little bit of consternation in this election, Georgia and Louisiana. Both states have a rule that says if no candidate gets at least 50% of the popular vote, then they go to a runoff election. Well, okay, so what's the big deal? Well, the Louisiana isn't such a big deal. The runoff election is in early December. Okay, but when's Georgia's runoff election? January. So we literally could go this entire lame duck session, and I think you would agree this lame duck has quite a bit of things they need to get done, not knowing who's going to be in majority in the 114th Senate. That's a very plausible scenario. I started to say likely, but it's not likely. It's plausible that we could end up in that environment. But what we do know for sure is coming out of this election, we know we're going to have a Democratic President Obama. We know we're going to have a Republican House of Representatives. So we're still going to have that split government that we've come to love and enjoy so much. We're going to have that for a few more years, at least through 2016 at this point. So the real question is, what are the impact of these elections? And I somewhat let the cat out of the bag. I already told you the Republicans are not going to get to 67 votes, so repeal's off the table. But I really don't think that's the biggest question the Republicans need to answer as it relates to health care. What they really need to be asking themselves at this point is, how are we positioning the party for 2016 around this health care issue? Over the next 2 years, do we just continue to do nothing, absolutely nothing around health care? Or do we put forward our own idea to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act with a market-friendly solution? Or do they move forward and just propose tweaks to the Affordable Care Act to make it more market-friendly? Watch that dialogue play out in the Republican Party. Much has been made about this divide within the GOP party, and we've heard nothing about it for the last 2 months or so, because now we're into general election season. But let me just tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that divide within the GOP party is very real and very much alive in Washington, D.C. So watch that play out as it relates to this health care issue. The other question is around tax reform. We are now saying, as sad as it is, and don't get me wrong, there'll be a lot of talk about tax reform in the 114th Congress. We just don't believe personal tax reform is going to happen. We see that now pushing off past 2016. And the follow-up question we often get is, what about estate taxes? Because that's a little bit of a cocooned part of the tax law. Well, right now, both parties are holding estate tax reform out there as a bargaining chip for personal tax reform. Because we don't believe personal tax reform is going to move forward, we do not believe that we will have any type of tactical estate planning tax changes, certainly nothing monumental. So with that, it leads us into corporate tax reform. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, not this summer, but last summer, we literally were within 2 weeks of getting corporate tax reform done. And we can talk about for hours the politics that went on behind the scenes, but that's not the point. Bottom line is there's actually a lot of common ground there. All we're talking about is debating what do we do with that windfall of profit coming from those repatriated assets. Do we do a one-time spend like President Obama suggested on jobs training and infrastructure? Or do we use it to pay down the marginal rate even further like the Republicans want to do? That is the only debate that's left to be had and finalized as it relates to corporate tax reform. Now, that begs the question then, what's going to happen to this tax extender package? You may have a lot of business clients that are holding back on capital expenditures because they're wondering whether they're going to get that bonus depreciation for tax year 2014. You may have clients who are over 70 and a half, that are philanthropically inclined, that you often were told, or you suggested in the past that they make their direct RMD transfer directly to a charity of their choice. By making the direct transfer from their IRA to a charity, it doesn't cycle through their personal tax return, and therefore it can't increase their effective tax rate. It just makes that charitable giving that much more powerful for the donor. Both of those issues are caught up in this tax extender package that we have right now. Both parties agree that that extender package must pass in the lame duck session. So for your philanthropically inclined clients over 70 and a half, we believe they'll still have that opportunity to do that direct transfer. For your bonus depreciation clients, I think one of the upsides that we could see coming out of this lame duck session is a 2-year extension to that bonus depreciation. That could be one of those economic upside surprises, and we could finally see some of this cash, from a business perspective, some of this cash getting redeployed for economic growth. That's one of the positive things that we're looking at. So we've got 13 minutes, and I want to take some questions and see what's on your mind, what questions you're getting from your clients, but then I have a few minutes that I want to wrap up with at the end. So let's see what questions or comments you have. Yes, back here.
Great presentation, thank you.
Thank you.
This has to do with a proposal that came up, discussion about taxing earnings in IRA accounts that came up a few years ago. And also you had something up there about forced Roth issues for taxability. Is there any chance that the government can go ahead and tax Roth earnings or Roth distributions?
Yeah, you know, the federal government can do anything they want to some degree, right? The question is, what can they get away with before we show up with pitchforks, right? That's the real question. So the question on forced Roth, you asked two questions there, really. The one concern that a lot of high net worth individuals have is that Roth IRAs will now be taxable. I see no effort being made in that area, okay? That was much more of an internet rumor scare thing that was going on. What has been discussed, and I think will be discussed, and I think it's quite possible that it could eventually happen, as we talk about personal tax reform, is that Roth IRAs would now be subject to RMDs. Let's be honest, ladies and gentlemen, we figured out Roth IRAs a long time ago, didn't we? We figured out that they're not a retirement tool, are they? They're an estate planning tool. So we figured out how to kind of play with the system that benefit our high net worth investors. Well, Congress is asking themselves, well, hold on a second. We gave this very unique tax status to this type of an account for retirement, but you're using it for estate planning and wealth transfer. So they're saying, you know what, if we're going to give you that tax-free growth and tax-free distributions, it must be used during retirement. So I think any discussion around Roth would center much more around the idea of an RMD for Roth IRAs. Now, the second question, you referenced my presentation about forced Roth. I want to explain again what that means. What they're suggesting is above a certain income threshold, half of your retirement savings would be can go to a pre-tax 401k, but the second half would be forced to go to a Roth 401k. Okay, so it's not saying that you can no longer use a traditional 401k. They're bifurcating your retirement savings into pre-tax and post-tax. Okay. Yes, sir. Yeah, the question is, what happens if we don't address the runway deficit? Well, that's a great question, ironically, because a lot of people think it means we go bankrupt, right? Or we default and things like that. I think, unfortunately, if we do not address it, we will be dealing with default discussions, but we will not default. We are an asset-rich country. We really are. For God's sakes, we bought Alaska. We could sell Alaska if we had to, right? I mean, yeah, I know. I'm sorry if I made anybody from Alaska mad, but we could. I'm sure the Russians would probably figure out a way to finance that. But the reality is we're an asset-rich country. So the likelihood of us actually going bankrupt or defaulting on our debt, we really see as nil. We, as a matter of fact, back in 2011 and some degree 2012, but primarily 2011, we were advising our clients, oh my God, get ready, get some powder dry, because that's going to be a great buying opportunity. And you saw that every single time we were in that default scenario, default discussion, there was a great equity buying opportunity. So we see those discussions as buy-in opportunities, points of entry for clients who have some, cash on the sideline. Yeah. Yes.
Is there still a concern with who is financing our debt as far as
Yeah, the question is there still a concern of who's financing our debt? Great question. Japan and China, but primarily China, have been buying about 80% of the U.S. Treasuries issued since 2008. We know that earlier this year they had actually been decreasing their holdings, right? They've been they've been slowing their purchases of U.S. debt, lowering aggregate demand for Treasuries. But at the exact same time, our own Federal Reserve, through tapering, had been backing off their purchases, again lowering demand for U.S. Treasuries. So the question was, with lowering demand of U.S. Treasuries, what should have been counterbalancing that? Right? Interest rates should have been going up. We didn't experience that. As a matter of fact, quite the opposite. And it wasn't until July we figured out why. Because the theory had been that you and I and our pension funds and our insurance companies have been gobbling up that excess demand. But if you did the math, supply-demand didn't equal a bond rally. It may have been a flatlining of interest rates, but certainly not a bond rally. So what we found in July was very interesting. We found out that China, through third-party intermediaries, had been continuing their Treasury purchases. They just didn't want it to be seen publicly as easily. So it was only through some other disclosures that we were able to figure out that no, they had not been slowing their purchases. But our insurance companies and pension funds had been adding. So there was actually a little bit of increase in demand for bonds, hence the rally. So the concern is who is financing our debt. Right now we're at about 73% of publicly held debt, and China makes up a fair portion of that. I don't think it's overly concerning share of that. I mean, the concerns that people have was, oh my God, China's going to own everything. As a matter of fact, they're now buying the Waldorf Astoria. If you saw that today, they're buying. They made a bid and bought that for a couple $2 billion. That China was going to end up owning all of our debt, and we were going to be beholden to China. Well, let me ask a question. If you've ever loaned money to your brother-in-law, who's got the power in the position? Is it your brother-in-law or you? You would hope it's you, but let's be honest. At some point, who owns who? And who has the power? So there's a net neutralization factor in any country that owns a lot of your debt. So I personally don't have a lot of concern there. I think that would be a great question to ask your wonderful economists. I think you're going to have them in breakouts, if not on stage. So, question over there. I think there was one over here, wasn't there? Okay. Yes. Yes, sir.
Is there any serious conversation on a carbon tax or national sales tax?
A serious question about carbon tax or sales tax. Carbon tax, no. And I say it's not serious because there's no way it's going to get through the House. And of course, the House is where that has to be started from and move through the House. Today, the second part of that question was around a national sales tax. Well, how many of you here knew that we actually had a national sales tax at one point? Did you know that? We had one after World War II, and it was there just to pay down the war debt. That's how that plus demographics is how we got out of debt so quickly after World War II with the economic growth of GIs coming home and making babies and all that fun stuff. So the challenge though today is if you went to a national sales tax, you got to be careful because it's a fair tax. You'll hear from Republicans all the time, we want a flat tax, we want a fair tax, we want a consumption tax, all these types of taxes, right? The reality is if you really understand tax behavior, you don't want it. And the reason why is if it's fair at 18%, guess what? It's just as fair at 20, and it's just as fair at 22. So that's your concern with any type of fair tax is that it's too incrementally, or death by 1,000 cuts, right? So you have to be able to trust your federal government on the sales tax side to only have that tax in place for a stated period of time and cap that tax. And I don't know, how many of you trust the federal government to cap themselves? No sales tax. Yeah. Last question, then I want to kind of wrap up real quickly. Anyone? Okay, great. Well, let me just kind of wrap up real quickly. I mentioned earlier that for your wealthier clients that are philanthropically inclined, who are over 70 and a half, I believe you're still going to have that opportunity to make those direct transfers. So have those clients hold back. I know as you get closer to the holidays, they're going to get a little antsy and want to move forward. But again, both parties understand that extender package has to pass. In addition to that, and this kind of goes back to my our discussion with Sue, is that as an industry, we need to pay more attention to tax drag. Let's be honest, we've been lazy as an industry for the last 14 years because tax rates have been so low. What I'm suggesting and what I tried to point out is that the progressivity of the code is what's changing. And that progressivity curve is likely to impact your highest income, highest net worth clients disproportionately moving forward. And I think the real value of a financial advisor is one that understands not only asset allocation, but let's be honest, we can somewhat outsource that to home office and so forth, but it's understanding how that right asset allocation marries with the right product allocation looked at through that tax lens. And that takes knowing your client. And the good thing about that is no computer will ever be able to replace that value that you can provide to that client. I think that is truly the definition of value in the future. And strategies like tax harvesting, tax managed, tax-free, tax-deferred, all of those things are going to be more and more valuable to your highest net worth clients. And then my final bullet point here is around income sustainability and retirement sustainability. If any of you have talked to your clients about annuity products in the past, you may have fallen into the trap of using the G word, right? Guaranteed. What happens when you tell a client something's guaranteed? They probably get a little skeptical, don't they? They kind of pull back and say, okay, what's the catch? What I encourage you to do is change that dialogue with your clients. Start talking about building retirement sustainability. And I suggest the dialogue could go like this. Bob and Mary, when I worked with your parents, my job was easy. I was just there to make sure that they could take the family on a bigger vacation or have the condo in Florida or whatever the case is. But when I started working with your generation, and honestly my generation, my job changed tremendously. Now, I have a job that's very different because your parents had the fortunate opportunity to have a pension fund. They had sources of guaranteed lifetime income. Well, you and I don't have that, do we? So it's my job now to build sustainability into your portfolio. And that sustainability comes from a personal understanding of your unique situation, your unique tax scenario, and how I marry that proper allocation with the right product offering to make all that marry together to increase sustainability. You have that discussion with a client, completely different. You're going to see them lean in and engage in that discussion because now you're talking about what they care about. They want to make sure that income is there in perpetuity for them, whatever their bequests are and so forth. Now, if you like anything we talked about today, you can see our website here, thewashingtonupdate.com. But let me ask a question. How many of you are on Twitter? Quick show of hands. Yeah, that's the problem that we've had in the business, is that we came out with this Twitter site, and it's great, we have a lot of followers, but come to find out, maybe 10% of our audience is actually on Twitter. And the reason we came out with Twitter is I know your financial reading inbox is this deep, and I can't do anything about that. But what I can help you with is your political and tax reading. And we do that via Twitter, because every single day we find articles in our daily research that we think are valuable, and we'll tweet that article out. 1, maybe 2 a day. So it's not overwhelming. But it allows me to keep you abreast as to what we're reading that we think is valuable, and cutting through a lot of the BS that's out in the marketplace. Well, because none of our clients had Twitter, we came out with an app. If you're on an Android device, you can download our app. We're in the Apple approval process. If anyone here knows somebody at Apple, please have them approve our app. It's been 3 weeks. Literally, look for us in your, what's that? Oh, I thought somebody said something. But anyway, thank you very much. I appreciate your time today. I hope you have a great rest of your meeting. Thank you.